Yep, and the main session will be anti-woke. How we fight the woke industrial complex. A very, very important session for lovers of freedom, and a great card of guests and speakers as well.
Now, we've been having a lot of fun down here in Melbourne. Sydney, how are you guys going? It's been a long day for you too.
Yeah, we're going great. We've been going the hard yards and going all night. We actually upgraded our host, as you can see to our right.
Yes.
We've upgraded to Misty, the office dog. She actually heads up the entire organisation, which doesn't really say a lot.
I was going to say that John's looking a little bit rough.
Yeah, I mean,
I was thinking of a pun. You beat me to it.
That's a nice dad joke there, Chris.
I am a dad twice, so I'm allowed. Brian, why don't you tell us about the upcoming session?
Yeah, so the upcoming session, we're going to throw across to Rex Murphy. Now, Rex is someone that Tim has told us numerous times, every time he hears Rex speak, that it is the greatest speech he's ever heard. And then he'll hear Rex speak again, and then it's the greatest speech he's ever heard. And then he'll hear Rex speak again, to the point that I'm not actually sure how good these speeches can get before Tim just throws in the towel and says it's never going to get any better. So I'm going to throw across to Rex. Rex, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll get started with you.
Well, those speeches are really first class. I have to agree there. I tell you where I'd like to start. It's on this damn so-called cancel culture. We've had a couple of episodes here in Canada that are egregious even by the standards of the world. We had the chairman of the board of governors of a very great institution in British Columbia, a full university. You don't get to be chairman of a board of governors without having a life of some minimal accomplishment. Businessman, man that supported many things, gets on the university board, becomes chairman of the board. He gets, inverted commas, caught putting out a single tweet that might be interpreted as possibly having some small sympathy with the administration of Donald Trump. And within less than an hour of Canadian daylight saving time, he's no longer chairman of the board. And secondly, he comes up with one of those apologies that many have made reference to as paralleling the Cultural Revolution in China and people getting beat over the head with bamboo sticks. He comes out, I'm sorry for what I've done. My life is not up to now is purely wretched. He was just tossed away. Then there's another, I don't expect people outside of Canada to know the name, but one of the best and longest serving columnists with the Toronto Globe and Mail, a retired person. Her name is Margaret Wente. And she was guilty occasionally of having thoughts that might be termed small c conservative. Anyway, a very prestigious organization in Toronto, if that's not an oxymoron, Massey College, decided to, in her retirement, make her a fellow. And they do that fairly often. Well, within an hour of the nomination secured by all of them, suddenly there was this tremendous cry from the usual riotous peasants on Twitter. The volume grew, the mob was loud, and then Massey basically uninvited her. So here's a woman, established reputation, first-class writer, by the way. Massey is a paragon of diversity and inclusion and broad-mindedness and intelligence. And if they get a whimper from the little wasp nest of Twitter, they toss her out. I also committed a sin myself. I'm still around, by the way, which is a great grief to very many people. I wrote a nasty column that actually asserted that Canada was not innately, intrinsically, genetically racist. And I would think that as a citizen of Canada to say that the country is, fairly pleasant, likes to welcome new people, has all sorts of programs set up to promote multiculturalism and diversity. I would have thought a column that said, we're fairly good. However, that also got a storm of all sorts of things. Anyway, to get to the point, a lot of people, when they get attacked by these types, the cancel fanatics, they give in right away. And that's the biggest mystery to me. We're not in Soviet Russia of the 30s. We're not even in communist China of the present day. And if you bark back at these savages, why would you want to apologize? What is it that comes every time that this happens? There's this mewling, self-abasing, degrading, self-stripping in public. I have my sackcloth and ashes and I will walk to Rome. I don't know, now for Brendan and Robbie to get in on this, I don't know why in our democracies, when one set of fools and fanatics decides that they own the culture, that the other people just tell them to use the colloquial F off. Who the hell are you? Cancel culture is partly built by the cowardice and timidity of institutions, by a very lazy and also extremely timid main press, and by people forgetting that they are all in countries, the ones I'm speaking of, that fought wars for democracy, free speech, and free thought. So why are we genuflecting to these fools and petty tyrants?
Thank you for that. Thanks, Rex. Appreciate it. And we're back. Got our video back. Caught up with you. Next, we are going to Robbie Suave. We're having a bit of a debate here, Robbie. You have to help us out. How do we say your surname?
Suave, but I don't correct anyone. It's fine.
Suave. I got that right. I listened to him. I shouldn't. There you go. Robbie Suave, senior editor at Reason. So it's becoming a bit of a Reason convention now. We had Nick on earlier. You've been doing a bit of work shining light on the stupidity that goes uninvestigated by people who call themselves mainstream media and doing it quite well. We appreciate your work. Apparently, Robbie's also put out his first book, I think, Panic Attack, written about a year ago, and it's been a whole year, Robbie, and you haven't written another book, so you're going to have to get working. But anyway, over to you, Robbie. Tell us your story.
Sure. So my book, Panic Attack, is about a lot of the issues we're discussing here today. Cancel culture, the threats to free speech on college campuses, and then it moving off of college campuses onto social media, and then kind of taking over workplaces, elite media institutions, and then we all end up living under the tyranny of kind of this small subset of very progressive leftist people who don't share, broadly speaking, free speech norms, and everyone is running afraid of them, just like Rex was talking about. I think it's important. So this is mostly a cultural phenomenon, but it is important to understand that there's a somewhat of a legal kind of edifice beneath it, propping it up. Obviously, in the United States, the Constitution, the First Amendment, the Supreme Court, there's tremendous protection, formally, officially, for offensive speech. The Supreme Court is the most pro-free speech it's ever been in its entire history. Routinely matters that get all the way to the court. You have offensive speech that provokes, speech that causes other people distress. They say that's okay every time. The problem is it doesn't always get to that level, and there's all sorts of kind of little quasi-legal regimes, particularly on university campuses and increasingly in the workplace, to punish provocative speech or speech that causes other people emotional distress. And I'm so worried, and we're seeing this happening now, activists doing the same thing they did on campuses. They're doing it to the workplace. So what they did on campuses often involved a law called Title IX, which, for instance, which prohibits gender or sex-based discrimination in education in the United States. So what that meant when this law came into being in 1975, they intended it so that, if you had a male team or club and there was comparative interest in having a female team or club, you had to have that club too. You couldn't just have the male club. So, perfectly benign intention there to address what was probably very real sexism in the educational institutions. Fast forward to 2011, the Obama administration starts putting out guidance telling universities explicitly they have to investigate any accusation of a sexual harassment or discrimination, no matter how ridiculous or nonsensical. It didn't have to be the standard of an objective person, which is often a legal standard, so that you don't just get everyone suing everyone for everything. It has to be something that's offensive to an objectively reasonable person. They said no to that. The universities were required, at risk of losing their federal funding, to open these ridiculous Kafkaesque Title IX investigations to deal with all problematic actions and speech that remotely involved sex or gender for some reason. This resulted in professors facing sanction for just teaching sexually charged themes in their classroom. I mean, you could be a literature professor talking about Shakespeare, and you could be investigated for having a perfectly mundane, perfectly germane to the class discussion about these issues. Professors who actually critiqued Title IX or criticized it for going overboard and for imperiling their academic freedom. Those professors were investigated in some cases for violating Title IX by the act of criticizing it was deemed impermissible retaliation against students who supported Title IX. So that kind of insanity was festering on campuses for years. And I think there were a lot of sort of mainstream liberals. I'm seeing them opening up now and speaking about this now, saying that they always thought, yeah, this is ridiculous, but it's not that important because it's just college. And as soon as students leave college, the real world hits them in the face, and then this is all over with. So, Robbie, you're a little obsessed with this. Does this really matter? That's the feedback I would get. Not that I was wrong, but like it's just not that important. I think we're seeing now why it was extremely important, because this kind of culture of suppressing speech because your speech is harassment and I have a right not to feel harassed in the school or in the workplace is, to my mind, absolutely the tool that is being used to fight speech. You're seeing, so for instance, the New York Times recently had to fire their opinion editor after the staff became furious that the editor had run an op-ed by Tom Cotton, and noticed that the criticism of it was not that it's wrong. I mean, that was the criticism some people made, but the criticism of the staff members was that it made them feel unsafe. It contributed to an unsafe or a hostile work environment. So then it becomes a legal matter. So you're wondering why people cave to kind of the woke mob. It's because there's a concern that you have liability risk if you're subjecting students or employees to a hostile environment. And so it's very clear to me that the activists, the kind of people who want to censor speech or stop speech from taking place, have figured out that this is a really good way to do it, is to cite risk to personal safety in a zone that is supposed to be shielded or protected from safety, conflating their emotional harm with their actual physical safety. Just to give one more example, just last week, the whole letter discourse debacle. A bunch of people, so many of them friends of mine, people I respect on the right and the left, a lot of people on the left actually, signed this open letter saying essentially the cancel culture is a problem. It's a problem when people in positions where they have to be allowed to speak their mind and risk giving offense, that they can be fired or in trouble for doing that. It's a problem for a culture of liberalism, blah, blah, blah. Very, very sort of normal stuff that wouldn't seem that controversial. So this open letter comes out, and then immediately, just like that, you have a ton of the more activist woke left saying that, it was horrible to sign this letter. If you're signing this letter, and actually so the letter was signed by a kind of senior person at Vox, which is this very left of center news and opinion outlet. And so Matt Iglesias signed it. But then one of his staff members, who is a trans woman, said that him signing it made her feel less safe at work. And so that's the language they use, less safe, because the workplace has to be safe according to various workplace safety laws that were never really designed to, I think, include emotional harm. But that's what the activists have kind of successfully lobbied to include under that definition. So that's a huge problem. That will be the next front. It's already the front we're enduring right now. The threats to free speech are coming from this nebulous safety concern that involves, to some place, the responsibility employers and institutions have to provide people physical safety.
Excellent. Thank you. I mean, actually, what you said there, what you described isn't excellent. Your speech was excellent. What you described is quite worrying. And please stick around for the Q&A. But before we get to that, we're going to throw to, I think it's fair to say, everyone's favorite Marxist, if he's still living under the self-description of being a Marxist. I'm not sure if he still is. He can tell us himself. The editor of Spiked Online and everyone's favorite troublemaker, Brendan O'Neill.
Thank you very much. Okay, I want to say a few things about cancel culture. The first thing I want to say is that I think cancel culture is a very imprecise term for a very serious problem. I think it's an amorphous term. It's not particularly useful. My main issue with the term cancel culture is that I think it underestimates the seriousness of the crisis we currently face. Because cancel culture sounds, a bit timid, a bit coy. you're just saying to people, I don't like you, or I'm going to push you out of my life, or whatever it might be. But actually, the climate we live in, for which we haven't found the language to describe just yet, is actually quite a terrifying one. We live in a climate in which people can have their lives destroyed because of what they think. And I think there are lots of words we can borrow from history to describe that. We can call it McCarthyite, we can call it Orwellian, we can say that it is a culture of intolerance, we can say that it reflects John Stuart Mill's concerns about the tyranny of custom and the tyranny of wisdom, which put an enormous amount of social pressure on people to believe a particular thing and to say a particular thing. All of those historical phrases are quite useful in describing the current climate we're living in, but I don't think they capture the depth and the seriousness of what's going on. And just to give you guys an example of the seriousness of what's happening, and I'm sure you are familiar with these cases, following on from Robbie's comments about the Harper's letter on cancel culture, of course, one of the signatories was J.K. Rowling, who is a cultural phenomenon, probably the most famous author in the world, a huge cultural figure, which means that she is uncancelable. She cannot be cancelled. People now refer to her as she who cannot be cancelled, which really irritates the cancel culture mob, the fact that they can't bring her down. But I think it's worth thinking about the reason why she is being targeted for cancellation. And the reason she's been targeted for cancellation is because she believes in biological sex, because she believes that there are men and women and one cannot become the other. Now, this was a perfectly legitimate view and a perfectly legitimate belief and a perfectly factual belief for millennia. And in a very short period of time, it has become unsayable in polite society. It has become the kind of thing which, if you express in public, you will be hounded, you will be demonized, you will be talked about as transphobic and evil and scum, essentially. And I think that's the level of censorship we have reached at the moment. We've reached a level where perfectly legitimate points of view, perfectly factual points of view, are now seen as being beyond the pale. And when you get to a situation where it is difficult to say in public that there is a difference between men and women, that sex cannot be changed, that chromosomes are immutable, when it becomes difficult to say those things in public, then you know that you have reached an incredible crescendo of thought policing, thought crime, and a culture in which it's very difficult to say anything at all. I want to give you a couple of other examples of people who have been cancelled, to use the polite metaphor, in the United Kingdom. Another person was the Labour MP Sarah Champion. Sarah Champion was on Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. She was sacked from his shadow cabinet because she wrote an article talking about largely Muslim grooming gangs in the north of England who were found to have been targeting white working class girls for abuse and rape and other forms of systematized degradation. And this is a fact. This has been proven in the court of law. There have been numerous convictions on the basis of this. And yet, for writing about this phenomenon, for writing about the fact that there are largely Muslim grooming gangs targeting white working class girls, Sarah Champion lost her position in politics and was cast out of polite society. Another example is Graham Linehan. Graham Linehan is very well known in the UK and Ireland as the writer of a brilliant sitcom called Father Ted, which was an Irish sitcom about priests. And he was recently expelled from Twitter. He was banned from Twitter because he doesn't think that transgenderism is a legitimate view of the world. He doesn't think you can change sex, and therefore his view is unacceptable in public life. One more example is Alistair Stewart. Alistair Stewart is an incredibly famous newsreader in the UK. He's known to most people who watch the evening news. He lost his job. He will no longer be seen on the evening news because he quoted Shakespeare in a Twitter exchange with a black man, and people considered his quote from Shakespeare to be racist when anyone with any shred of intellectual integrity knows that it was not. So it was a case of mistaken racism. Those are just a handful of examples of how serious this situation has become, where people can be cancelled, i.e. censored, i.e. banned from the public sphere, cast out of polite society, either because they believe in biological sex, or because they quote Shakespeare, or because they say things which in some other fashion is considered now to be unacceptable and beyond the pale. We're really reaching an incredible situation where it's difficult to say anything. It's difficult to express any kind of point of view. And this woke tyranny, I think we really need to really start to challenge it, start to think about seriously about what it means, what it represents, what it reflects, what it tells us about our society. And I think we're living through a situation where the term cancel culture doesn't quite capture the depth of the situation. What is really going on is a climate of witch hunting, where evil women like J.K. Rowling can be cast out of polite society simply for expressing views on sex and gender. A climate of McCarthyite politics, where people can be expelled from campuses and thrown out of universities because they don't adhere to the new orthodoxies on political correctness and woke belief systems, and a climate of literalist humorlessness, where people can even be cancelled for telling certain jokes or for saying things that get misinterpreted by willful censors on the internet. So I think one of the things we've got to think about incredibly seriously is the climate of censorship and self-censorship that have arisen over the past 3 or 4 years, and the question of what we can do about this. I think Rex raises an incredibly important point, which is, why are people caving into this? Why are some people going along with this, apologizing for things that they know are true, whipping themselves across the back simply because they said something that is unacceptable in polite society? Where are the people who are willing to stand up and say, I will not apologize, I will not self-flagellate, I will stand by my beliefs even if you don't like them? And that kind of enlightenment determination to stand by your convictions, well, it's a Martin Luther conviction more than anything else. That Lutheran conviction that you should stand by your beliefs even if society or the moral majority hates you for it, that is sorely missing in this climate. And I think the impetus, or rather the onus, is on all of us who believe in freedom to stand by what we believe, regardless of how much hatred comes our way.
Excellent and beautifully said. I think we're probably all in furious agreement about this, that there is a serious problem here with the woke virus or the woke industrial complex. We're all coming up with new fancy names. But we're probably in furious agreement about it being a problem. And then some of the issues we're talking about is the need to actually speak up and stand up. And then another part of the question is how to then convince the middle ground or the average person to be aware of the size of this threat. We'll talk about all of those. I wanted to go on a tangent for the first question, and that is a step back. The wokistas are certainly a threat and they need to be fought, but where did they come from? And I mean, what led to the sudden introduction or the evolution of a bunch of young people who are so easily offended, who's run around actually feeling as though everything can hurt them? Is there a root cause here? Now, I understand we eventually just have to go and fight them and beat them, but I also want to know what went wrong. What went wrong with our culture or our parenting or something in our society that we allowed these hordes of young ferals to grow up and start ruining our culture? And does Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, have anything to say about it? Let's start that with whoever wants to jump in, but Rex, you might need to unmute yourself.
I tell you what, you raise a very good question. Before I answer it directly, I want to underline something that Brendan said, because I think it's also consequential. We have these tag names for things. They're as quick as the internet. And cancel culture, he's entirely right to say that we need to search for something that suggests the depth and the peril. It's an actual peril. As your closing thought, your closing exchange, and as he pointed out, you're also ruining lives. As to how we got there, we could do another 24-hour broadcast on that, but the broad scheme is very simple. The way the hard left approaches these things. They may not have a design that is universal at its beginning, but they find the weak spots, and they always proceed almost by osmosis. They find the best of causes. I mean, who could be against, say, the destruction of the planet by global warming? I think here's a good one to bring up, incidentally. When we're talking about global warming, we're not into the sexual culture, we're not into religion or ethnicity or race. But I saw even 15 or 20 years ago that even on a topic, I like to call it the weather, that if you opposed the so-called consensus on global warming, and if you either made a speech about it or you wrote an article, you got the most furious attacks. And the idea that there could be a dissenting view on what is the material matter of science. This is not a religion, it's not race, it's not sex, but there was a spot. And I went, in my own particular case, a lot of my fellow citizens are from a place called Newfoundland. They're low class. I don't mean that in the cultural sense. They're low class in terms of their salary. And they've got to leave the province to get jobs. And we had a great crisis in Newfoundland. I'll make this very short. They went to Alberta to the oil industry, and they found work, which was a great thing. And I thought it might be a nice thing to say that, you know something, my province was saved by an industry that warms the world and provides the energy for all its industry and first world prosperity, which is a very neutral opinion. You could get slammed, and I was slammed, you could get threatened for an articulation with no political intonations of a great benefit of a natural industry. And when I spoke with the oil companies, this is the bigger point I want to make. This is 15 years ago. Even the people who were in the industry were shy of saying in closed rooms that they thought the criticism of their industry was unfair. They were internalizing the indictment of their enemies. It began, by the way, also in the schools. In the schools, the global warming juggernaut, you'd have grade threes taking pictures out of a magazine of the Amazon rainforest. They weren't being taught science. They were being propelled by attitude. And in a certain sense, the climate debate, there are others, was a Trojan horse in saying, on this particular topic, there is one point of view that is sanctified, and there is another point of view that is heretical. And I saw that even 10, 15 years ago, that people in the industry itself had built up a timidity to defending themselves. It began with the schools. Robbie is entirely correct to locate, especially in the humanities of the arts universities. I'm with Jordan Peterson on this. All arts courses with studies in them should be burnt down and sowed with ashes. But we have been gradually minimizing the training of intellect for the introduction of attitude. But how it is that hard left politics has become the kind of silent censor inside of so many people, there's two things. We should not neglect the media. I do not know what it is about the Western press, and I'm including Europe in that has decided that it is no longer a witness or reporter or a mediator, but a participant in the conceptualization of issues, in particular campaigns, their jihad against Trump. The media, somehow or other, have become concordant with this urgency of stopping people from saying things or not letting people up. My own CBC here in Canada, in the 20 years that I was at it, I would count on one finger an interview that challenged the global warming thesis. But 10 times a day on 20 programs a day, you would have the other stuff. The press is an educator as well as anything else, even if it's educating in a bad way. They have sowed the minds of people that these opinions are okay to have and these are not. And finally, I'll get off of it. When we talk about how this has happened, we're talking about the managerial elites, the academics, the journalists, those that are pretty well off, those that are in the higher class industries. Here's what I know about how to challenge this stuff. If you walk the streets of ordinary towns, if you talk to the guy who comes in to fix your sink, or if you get in a taxi driven by some guy from Somalia, you're not hearing wake culture. You're hearing the actual expression of opinion unmoderated by some internal censor. It's the class that feeds the communication and political industry that have concocted or built this atmosphere. It developed by osmosis. It developed by deliberate attack by the really hard left radicals. And it also developed because so many people, and I'm glad that Brendan brought it up, they go into this torment, this crucifixion of self-abasement. And that's the one point that I find myself most angry about. It's one thing to be told that you're a bad person, but if you know you're not, and your point of view is real, why in the hell would you strip yourself naked and flagellate yourself in public to a bunch of people you really despise? That's not a great answer, but it'll have to do.
Oh, that's a pretty good answer. Robbie, Brendan, do you guys want to jump in with what did we do wrong to these kids? Who hurt them to have them grow up to be such ferals?
It's important, I think, to remember, because people ask this, how could it be, all young people, they hate free speech, they all want to cancel everyone. But of course it isn't all young people, even. It's a minority. It's a small number of people we're talking about. Actually, even among Democrats, right, you would find probably most of them agree with J.K. Rowling on the issue she's being canceled over. So the problem is a very small number of militant, woke, progressive young people who happen to occupy the most vocal positions in society, who work for elite media institutions or are very vocal on social media. You see them, so you hear from them, and you think I think this happens to the left, to Democrats rather, that they think these people are overrepresentative. So then maybe it's important to mimic their views, when actually you might very well lose votes by doing that. And sort of Donald Trump kind of deftly exploited that, or maybe not. Maybe Donald Trump doesn't do anything deftly, but accidentally or inadvertently exploited that. Obviously, Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about the coddling culture and safetyism being a root of some of this. So I also think safetyism or appeals to one's safety have been the mechanism by which canceling or free speech, or whatever you want to call it, is taking place. So you can draw a sort of line back to the kind of the parenting culture of the 90s, which became very, very overprotective and afraid of made up danger to kids, and they became more sheltered, and you have the every kid gets a trophy kind of stuff. I'm careful about drawing too much, though, of a causal arrow there, because that's just a theory. There's no evidence of that. I can't point to this specific study showing, oh yes, kids who grew up in exactly this environment are the ones doing the canceling now. I suspect at least some of that is the case. The other big reason, I think often overlooked, for why we have this cancel culture moment now, is actually it's just much easier to find reasons to cancel people now that smartphones with cameras and social media exist. So there is now a living record of everything everyone says or does. Not everything, but to a tremendously greater degree than existed before the year, 2005. So all of those of us who grew up or who went through the stage of your life where you're prone to saying and doing dumb things and getting in trouble for them. So like me, I passed that age before everyone was running around with cameras taking videos of everything, before my inclination would be to tweet some stupid insult or slur. Where now that is not the condition that young adults are being socialized under now. Now they can do or say something, as all people do, and then 10 or 15 years later, when they're on the cusp of some great victory or championship or public recognition, some viciously cruel rival or enemy or journalist who has nothing better to do with their lives can go dig and find what they tweeted or what their friends said about them or their video of them from their adolescence and destroy their lives. And this happens all the time. And it's really, it's horrible. It's to my mind, the most horrible aspect of cancel culture. People getting in trouble. Sometimes they're not even famous people for wearing a dumb Halloween costume 15 years ago. In a time where these issues or what you're supposed to do or what was offensive was even much less settled or settled among the left than it is now. And there's more evidence of it. It's easier to do it. There's more of a record of people's behavior. We're living in a snitch culture. Everyone is a cop. There's no, so we're never putting this genie back in the bottle. By the way, like unfortunately, I don't think we're going to live in a more private society. So we're going to have to come up with some kind of informal norm that you just don't do this to people. It's wrong. Maybe it'll happen after every single person's like nude photos on the face of the planet have been leaked. We'll all forgive each other and move on. Something like that has to take hold because of the pace of technology. I don't foresee that the means, the method, the methodology of cancel culture. I don't see doing anything but accelerating in the future.
Now, it's an excellent point about the existence of forever tech, right? The technology that means our actions last forever. This forever tech has created a world, or it seems to be associated with a world that has lost the art of forgiveness. You say something stupid to a few friends, but if it's not recorded, it goes into the memory and gets forgotten and you're able to move on. Things that are part of forever tech seem to be harder for our modern culture to forgive. It's a really good point, and it's hard to solve something if it comes from technology. Brendan, did you have some comments on what we did wrong, how we hurt these kids?
Yes, I think I've always been very careful not to blame young people, millennials or Gen Z, for this phenomenon because I don't think it's their fault. I think they've been brought up badly. They've been educated badly. They've been educated to think that I think the prime problem is that they've been educated to think that their self-esteem is the most important thing in the world. And what that means is that they've been told continually, in fact, from when they were children right through to the age of when they go to university, they've been told that anything that harms their self-esteem is necessarily bad. So anything that challenges them, any point of view that makes them feel uncomfortable, any speaker or thinker who makes them feel undervalued, all of these things are bad, and therefore they should block them out and possibly try to destroy them or expel them from the public sphere. So they've been educated into this way of thinking by adults, by older people, by people in their 40s and their 50s and their 60s. So it's not young people's fault. They didn't come out of the blue. It's not a perfectly new generation of robotic thinkers who are suddenly destroying freedom of speech. It's far more complicated than that. And I think, from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s onwards, we really have seen the entrenchment of intolerant thinking in schools, in universities, in the political sphere. And all of that has trickled down to the new generation. My experience in the UK, I agree a lot with Rex. I think there's a strong class dynamic to this. So when I speak at, we call them Russell Group universities. In America, they call them Ivy League universities. When I speak at the British version of Ivy League universities, there's a very strong desire amongst the poshest students, the most upper class students, to censor things. So if you speak at Oxford or Cambridge, which I have done over the past few years, you will always be threatened with censorship. Sometimes you will be successfully censored. I was successfully banned from speaking at Oxford University in 2015 in a debate about abortion. I was going to make the pro-choice case. I'm a pro-choice person. But I was banned on the basis that I am a man and therefore I'm not allowed to speak about anything to do with abortion. I was also threatened with censorship at Cambridge and various other kind of high-level universities. But if you speak at, we call them red brick universities, which are the more working class universities, which sprung up in the 1960s and the 1970s, you will encounter far fewer of these problems. So there's a strong class element here. There's a strong element where the orthodoxy, the contemporary pressure to think in a particular way is very pronounced among the upper sections of society. But among the so-called lower sections of society, there remains a tendency towards heresy, a tendency towards free thinking, a tendency towards skepticism of what is considered to be the right way of thought. I completely agree with Rex that the vast majority of people out there, I think, would agree with J.K. Rowling that someone who has a penis and stubble and who was born male and went through male puberty is not a woman. Now, we might well agree that if he decides to self-identify as a woman, that we might, as a matter of courtesy, use female pronouns and use a female name. most of us are polite people, that's fine. But we don't believe that that's a woman. And I think the vast majority of people would think that and would agree with J.K. Rowling that this person is not really a woman and therefore should not be allowed in domestic violence shelters, should not be allowed in female changing rooms, should not be allowed to take his clothes off in front of 13-year-old girls. Most of us would agree with her that that's correct. It's a certain section of society that has bought into the eccentric, unhinged, unstable view of extreme political correctness, which says that men can become women simply by clicking their fingers, which says that everyone is defined by their racial heritage, which says that black people are permanent victims and white people are all privileged, whether they are poor white people or rich white people. Those are the new high status belief systems. Those are the new beliefs that exist among high status white people primarily, but they are not shared by the majority of society. So that really gives us an opening in this debate. That really gives us an opening in this discussion about freedom. The thing that concerns me a tiny bit about libertarians, and I mean no offense at all to Robbie, who I admire enormously, but one of the things that concerns me a little bit about libertarians is that I think they sometimes are slightly dismissive of the sentiments of the masses and democratic sentiment. And my view is that over the past 5 years, particularly via the vote for Brexit and also the vote for Trump, who is a far more complicated enterprise than Brexit. I think Brexit is uncomplicatedly good, whereas Trump is far more complex and difficult and disagreeable. But I think through those mass votes for those rebellious platforms, I think ordinary people, the masses, the millions, the teeming masses have done far more to dent and wound political correctness than lots of us kind of highfalutin thinkers and libertarian activists and think tank people have been able to do over the past 30 or 40 years. So one of the things I think is really important for us to bear in mind while we are defending freedom is that ordinary people are often 3 or 4 or 5 steps ahead of us. And instead of being slightly sniffy about democracy, we should actually start to embrace it as one of the best guards we have against the eccentricities of the elites, against the bizarre belief systems of the technocrats, and against the jaundiced outlook of that upper section of society who are often very disconnected from the rest of us. So I really do think we have to start warming to the idea that freedom will be delivered to us by democracy rather than by this kind of rather than by a kind of conflict within the upper classes itself.
That was a great series of answers there. We've dived into lots of parts of that answer, I got to say. And I like that the 3 of you touched on different parts of it. And I think all of you touched on important parts of the story of how we got here, what went wrong with the kids. I think, Brendan, you're wrong on democracy, but I'll let it go. But I liked your earlier answer at the beginning of it, where you basically said the problem with the kids, it's not their fault. You basically just blamed the hippies. It was all the hippies' fault. I like that. Just throw it back on the hippies. Robbie, I'd like to come to you with one point. During your talk, you said something that sounds superficially bad, and maybe it is bad, but it actually gave me hope. You pointed out that some of these problems of people acquiescing to the stupidity of the woke mob comes from some laws that exist. Now, what occurs to me is that if people are acquiescing to the mob because those laws exist, there is a policy solution. Now, the other concern is that the woke mob has actually infested the culture so much that people want to acquiesce. And if that's the problem, that is a deep-seated problem. That is harder to fix. But if there is a policy solution here, that actually gives me hope. So is there a chance that we can actually fix this problem policy-wise then?
You can certainly fix the policies. Whether the policies have been in place long enough that the culture will operate as if the policies exist even when they no longer do is the concern. So right now, one of the things the Trump administration has done that I most agree with, and they're few and far between for the most part, is the education secretary, Betsy DeVos, did rescind the guidance relating to Title IX. So this is specifically for schools. The previous guidance saying that they had to really militantly investigate and root out sexual discrimination, harassment, assault, and use these procedures that were totally unfair. And if they didn't just do it in the most over-the-top way, they could get in trouble. Betsy DeVos has said, you no longer have to do that. And here are the new standards we'd like you to use. They're much more fair. We're talking mostly about free speech, but there was a tremendous due process component of this. Students, professors accused of wrongdoing and just had no way to defend themselves under the standards advocated by the Obama administration. So that has been changed. It's actually in the course of the changes are being implemented now. But you're going to have lawsuits. You're going to have plenty of universities have hired administrators who will continue to do things the old way to the extent they weren't told you have to do it this new way. You just don't have to do it the bad way anymore. So I'm skeptical that even though that like the hard policy has been changed, I'm skeptical that it's going to do some good. Don't get me wrong. I'm skeptical that it's going to do nearly enough. And then that becomes, and then it's even more kind of fractured for the broader culture. The overlapping kind of workplace safety, harassment, all that stuff. You could theoretically roll it back. It's hard to see the political will to do that because it just takes so much more effort from different kind of political groups. It would be a very difficult battle. You might have more, I hate to rely on the Supreme Court for everything, but we're coming to the day and age where really, because Congress is so split and doesn't want to do anything without the president's approval anyway, even if the Republicans, they can have a majority, they have a majority in the Senate. Even when they had both congressional majorities, they won't operate without Trump's approval. So you really, it comes to it where the Supreme Court has, even though they're supposed to be just like, they're the judicial branch, but they're the ones almost doing lawmaking to a degree, because that's where you actually have a group of people who broadly reflect some sensibilities, but sometimes they disagree, sometimes they agree, and you're actually having them do the kind of legislative function, because the rest of our government is like so deadlocked or broken or dependent on the executive. So you could have the Supreme Court deal a blow to these kinds of laws if the right case came their way, or protect free speech in a way. Now, I don't anticipate that happening. Often, even in the contentious, like the cake baking case, when it got to them, the most recent one, they sided in favor of the cake baker, who didn't want to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding ceremony, and he won the case. But it wasn't because they were agreeing in principle. They just said that the lower court had been the lower authority had been so unfair to him and so anti-religious that he deserved to win the case. So they often try not to weigh in on the broader principle. So I think while there are certainly policies that can be improved, for the large part, this is a cultural thing and will need to be confronted in a cultural context. Or there will need to be some kind of cultural incentive, I guess, for companies, right? The problem is it's easy for the company to institute diversity training when someone gets in trouble, to kind of go through all the woke steps, because it is easy and it doesn't cost them that much to do that. And even though these trainings have been shown like over and over again, respectable liberals have found that these trainings are totally ineffective, may even like exacerbate racial tensions. But companies do them over and over again because that's like the thing you do. It's become kind of part of just the industry, or how the woke company operates.
Well, thanks, Robbie. You've totally dashed my optimism there. So I rescind my optimism. Brian.
Well, you've spoken about sort of a policy solution, but one of the questions that we're getting through from a lot of our viewers is, we're sort of preaching to the converted here. We all agree that woke culture is bad and that it must be defeated. How do we defeat that? I'll throw to Rex if Rex has any insight into that.
Yeah, I do, actually. Again, allow me a small prelude. I want to underline what I thought was a truly salient, significant point that was made by Brendan. that we, the useless people who show up on panels and do television shows or write columns, and I mean that useless, about 75% exact, we are not the world. And the idea, especially in the big media institutions, my own here at CBC in Canada, the assumption within the news mind is that whatever thoughts they have and whatever perspective they have are the only set of thoughts and the only set of things. However, if they walk 50 miles down the road, again, in the distinction made by Brendan, if you go to the red brick, you will find there's a whole universe of opinion because they're not into the opinion business that is neither being monitored, expressed, reported, or stated out there. The world is not as bad off in one sense about this woke garbage. It's just that a whole lot of people who are not in the woke, the woke circus are never talked to and are usually talked down. Now, as to how do you beat it? Well, it starts with you. I know that's probably an escape hatch, but it really is. I've been stressing, I think, in the few things I had to say, that unless I was in China, North Korea, or Russia, the idea I can say something, it involves no risk. I mean, you don't go to the gulag and you don't end up upside down in some iron ring being tortured with an electric rod. I don't know why so many of us in first world situations with great security and everything else, when you hear something so damn stupid as some 6'5" guy with shoulders bigger than most Brinks trucks declared that he's a woman, why you don't laugh out loud? Why have we lost the instinct that a real response, a genuine reflexive response to what is obviously a petty tyranny, they're pushing their ideas on you. I'd like to pick up this to when someone in the corporation, like Robbie mentioned the New York Times or the Reason article, or Harper's article, and the publication of the article made some person feel not safe. Well, it's idiotic. The generations before us were off in trenches and getting run over by tanks. They knew what trauma was. Why have we allowed these perfectly empty usages, like safe, to mean you've somehow or other triggered some infinitesimal dislike in the back of my mind? And I equate it with, why aren't the people who say that they felt not safe laughed out of the goddamn room? We know that this is not true. We know the claims. That's the other point. We know the claims that are being made. Oh, you made me feel this, or you're a racist, or whatever. You know that these are constructed accusations. In the majority of cases, the people who run these attacks on others don't believe what they themselves are saying. It's the old struggle for power conducted under a different aegis, a false language, deliberate duplicity, and mob control. The only way we will take it back, and by the way, I really want to agree with this thing of Brendan's on the idea that this class, of which, alas, I am one, the chatterers, are ever going to do it. They've chattered for 40 years while this whole thing built up. It was osmotic and tsunamic all at the same time. But it really is time for those who are not going to lose their life. The next time someone calls you a racist or a sexist, why are you buying the indictments of these hollow people of little mind and no conscience? It's time to find a spine. That's not a program, but it is a call.
Brendan, I'll throw to you on that same question. How do you defeat this?
Well, with at the risk of upsetting John even more, you defeat it via democracy. I really genuinely believe that. Now, I know for a fact that many people watching this will be skeptics of democracy. I've had so many run-ins with libertarians who think that democracy is a threat to their individual freedom, and I've spent a lot of the past 10 years trying to convince them that freedom and democracy go hand in hand and are not a threat to one another, but I have not done a particularly good job of that. But I think the way in which we defeat woke culture is through what was traditionally referred to as the wisdom of the crowd. Ordinary people are wiser than well-educated people. And this is not an accidental phenomenon. You know, there's that old cliche that I would rather trust the first 10 people I meet on the street to run the United States of America, rather than trusting people who had been educated at Harvard University. And this is not an anti-intellectual view. This is a view that ordinary people live in society in a way that those other people tend not to, and understand the strangeness and the ridiculousness of elite opinion in a way that members of the elite tend not to. You know, there was a movement in the United Kingdom in the 1840s called the Chartists, and the Chartists were a movement for the right of working class men to vote. It was a movement to expand the franchise to working people, and their view was very plainly that they openly said, we're not saying that ordinary working men are just as good at politics as lords and ladies and barons and bureaucrats. We're saying they are better. And the reason they are better is because they live in society in a way that those people don't. And this is not a facetious point. I think this is a really important point. If we're going to challenge woke culture, if we're going to challenge this culture that comes from removed, cut-off elites based in the academy, based in the bureaucracy, based in the technocratic elites, then we are going to have to turn to people who tend to be more naturally skeptical, who rely upon their fellow man and their fellow woman much more, and who are far more open to different ways of thinking. That's what the vote for Brexit tells us. That's what the vote for Trump tells us. It tells us that there are millions upon millions of people out there who don't buy into the woke ideology and who are a willing audience for the kinds of arguments we are making. And unless we tap into that mass sentiment, if we treat that mass sentiment as something dangerous and threatening, then we will lose even before we begin. And we have got to start treating that mass sentiment, which thinks that J.K. Rowling is correct, which thinks that campus culture is insane, which thinks that the idea of living in a safe space with colouring books and puppies that you can pet and all the other things that Robbie has written about extensively over the past few years, which thinks that all those things are completely and utterly nuts. Unless we tap...
Brendan, I understand what you're saying, but puppies are great. And we are well out of time. We've stretched it 5 minutes past. So I'll tell you what, come to the next Friedman. We'll give you a whole hour on the stage with everyone. Please do it. That goes to all of you. And I'd just like to say this was a great session. I really liked it. And thank you all very much for coming along and sharing your wisdom. And please stick around, come to the social room. We'll have a chat after this. But first, we're going to throw to the Melbourne studio. What did you guys make of that?